The dare began with laughter, but underneath the laughter was fear no one wanted to admit. The group of 5 knew the asylum's reputation, every rumor of patients screaming through the walls and doctors who vanished without explanation, yet that was exactly why they came. Cameras in hand, they wanted proof, or at least enough fake bravado to entertain their viewers. The locals had begged them not to go. After dark, the building wakes up, one woman had whispered at the diner when she overheard their plan. But the more they were warned, the more determined they became. Crossing the rusted gates felt like stepping out of the real world. Weeds grew tall, swallowing the path. The building itself loomed against the night sky, its windows broken like empty eye sockets. Every step toward the entrance felt heavier, as though the ground itself wanted to hold them back. Their leader, Evan, forced a grin, lifting his camera. "Tonight, the Silent Asylum gets exposed," he declared, but his voice echoed strangely, as if the building itself was mocking him. The doors were swollen with rot, and when Marcus shoved them open, the sound wasn't just a creak, it was a groan, long and painful, like something inside didn't want to let them in. A wave of damp, stale air rolled out, heavy with mildew and something sour. The group stepped into the lobby, their flashlights cutting through clouds of dust. Broken wheelchairs lay twisted in corners, files were scattered across the floor, and graffiti covered the walls, but underneath all that vandalism, the building's age was alive. It felt less abandoned and more waiting. Jenna, clutching her jacket tighter, muttered that it smelled wrong, not just of decay but something fresh, like breath lingering in the air. Evan brushed it off with a laugh, but even he couldn't ignore how cold it was inside compared to the night outside. Their footsteps echoed too loudly in the silence, bouncing back at them from hallways stretching endlessly into shadow. The dare was supposed to be simple: spend the night, capture footage, leave with proof. But standing in that dark lobby, every eye drawn to the cracked portrait of a doctor staring down at them, the group felt a weight pressing against their chests. The asylum wasn't just empty halls and rusted beds. It felt aware. And in that moment, with cameras rolling and nerves unraveling, none of them realized the dare was no longer theirs, it belonged to the asylum. The first whispers came when the group had just begun to settle into the idea that maybe the asylum was nothing more than crumbling walls and cheap scares. They had wandered past the lobby, deeper into a corridor lined with cells. The air was colder there, thick enough to sting their lungs with every breath, but they chalked it up to drafts sneaking through shattered windows. Their flashlights illuminated rusted bars and stained mattresses, restraints hanging like limp arms waiting to grab them. Still, Evan laughed into his camera, declaring it the perfect horror set. Then it happened, so faint at first they thought they had imagined it. A voice, no louder than a breath, floated through the darkness. One syllable, maybe two, impossible to make out, but undeniably human. Jenna froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. The others stopped moving, their footsteps echoing once, then dying into silence. The air seemed to hold its breath with them. Marcus muttered it was just the wind, but no one moved, their ears straining. The whisper came again, this time from farther down the hall. It wasn't the wind. It had rhythm, intention. A word formed and vanished, like someone speaking from the corner of the room just out of sight. Marcus lifted his camera, swinging it toward the sound, the beam of his flashlight bouncing across empty cells. Nothing moved, yet the whisper didn't stop. It trailed along the corridor, shifting from one side to the other, as if circling them. Jenna clutched Evan's arm, her eyes wide. "Someone's here," she said, but her voice cracked. Evan forced a grin for the camera, though his jaw tightened. "Old pipes." "Airflow," he said, but even as he spoke, the sound changed. The whispering grew sharper, faster, layering like multiple voices at once, all too soft to understand but too insistent to ignore. One of the explorers, Darren, stepped closer to a cell door, pressing his ear near the bars. His flashlight caught deep claw marks etched into the wall inside, scratches piled over scratches, as though someone had tried to dig their way out. "It's coming from here," he whispered. But the moment he said it, the whisper stopped. The corridor fell silent, so sudden it made their hearts pound louder than before. Then, from the darkness behind them, a laugh, dry, broken, like it came from a throat that hadn't been used in years, slid through the hall. The group spun around, flashlights shaking,
cameras recording every second.
Nothing stood there, nothing visible, but the silence afterward was worse than the sound. They realized in that moment the asylum wasn't empty.
Something was awake, and it was already playing with them.
The sealed ward waited behind a rusted chain and a door swollen with decades of damp air. The explorers found it by accident, following a side hallway that curved sharply into a dead end. At first it looked like any other part of the asylum: graffiti, broken tiles, a ceiling sagging under the weight of years, but then Jenna noticed the door. Unlike the others, this one was untouched. No spray paint, no dust disturbed on the chain, no signs of scavengers ever daring to break in. A single sign hung crooked above it, the paint faded but still legible: Ward C, restricted access. Marcus grinned at the sight, his nerves suddenly masked by excitement.
This is it.
This is where the good stuff is, he said, already pulling out his lock cutter from his backpack. Evan hesitated, his camera still aimed, but the way the red recording light flickered across the chained door gave him a chill he couldn't explain. "We don't know what's in there," Jenna muttered, her voice soft. "Exactly," Marcus snapped back, "and that's why we go in." The chain snapped with a loud crack, the sound bouncing down the hallway like a gunshot.
For a moment, no one breathed, waiting to hear if something answered.
Nothing did, but the silence pressed harder, like the building itself had tensed. Marcus shoved the door, and with a groan, it gave way, a cold draft spilling out so sharp it felt like stepping into a freezer.
Their breaths turned to mist instantly.
Inside, the ward was preserved in a way the rest of the asylum wasn't. Beds were still upright, their restraints hanging stiff, rust-frozen in place. Files lay stacked on metal trays, untouched by graffiti or looters. The walls, however, were not untouched. Every surface carried scratches, deep, frantic claw marks, layered over decades, some streaked with what looked like long-dried stains. Jenna lifted her flashlight to one wall and whispered, "These weren't animals, these were hands."
Darren flipped through a folder on the nearest tray, his camera angled down to capture the brittle papers. Patient files. Notes describing experiments, violent outbursts, and warnings scrawled in the margins: "Do not open the door. Voices are not theirs. The walls speak back." He stopped reading, his lips tightening as if the words themselves carried weight. Then their cameras began to glitch. The screens flickered, static cutting in and out, though the record lights stayed steady. Marcus tapped his camera angrily, but his movements slowed when the static formed shapes, faces, distorted, screaming silently through the grain. The group huddled together, every flashlight beam shaking as the temperature dropped further. A sound rose from the far end of the ward. Not a whisper this time, but a dragging scrape, metal against concrete, steady and deliberate. Evan lifted his flashlight, the beam trembling across the row of beds. Empty. The sound grew louder. They backed toward the door, hearts racing, but before they could retreat, the door slammed shut behind them with a violent echo. For the first time, no one pretended it was the wind. The sealed ward had been waiting. And now it had them. The surgical theater sat at the heart of the asylum, a wide room with tiered seating where once doctors had observed operations on the patients. The explorers stumbled upon it while trying to find another way out of the sealed ward. Their flashlights swept over rusted surgical tools left behind on trays, scalpels blackened with age, and a single chair in the center of the room, its restraints frayed but still sticky with something that hadn't rotted away. The air smelled sharper here, metallic, like iron baked into the walls. Darren was the first to step closer, his camera trained on the surgical chair. "This is insane," he whispered, voice unsteady but laced with awe. His lens zoomed in on the straps, the stains, the overhead lamp hanging crooked above like an unblinking eye. The others hung back near the doorway, unease thick in their silence. Jenna shook her head furiously. "We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't even be in this place," she said, her voice breaking, but Darren ignored her. He circled the chair slowly, filming every angle, as if the room itself was performing for him. His flashlight flickered once, then twice, before going completely dark. He cursed and slapped it, the beam stuttering back to life. When it did, the others gasped.
On his camera screen, Darren's face appeared, not the Darren standing in front of them, but another version of him, pale, wide-eyed, whispering directly into the lens. His lips moved fast, words spilling out like a prayer. "They're right behind me. Don't let them take me. Please, don't let them." The feed cut to static. "Darren, stop messing around," Evan barked, though his own voice shook. Darren didn't respond. He turned his head sharply toward the shadowed corner of the theater, his eyes locked on something the others couldn't see. His camera dropped to his side, forgotten, its light still pointed at the cracked floor. "Do you hear that?" he asked softly. "They're calling me." Before anyone could move, Darren walked into the shadows, his footsteps fading against the far wall. Jenna screamed his name, rushing after him, but when her flashlight beam swept the corner, there was nothing there. No Darren. No footsteps. Just the sound of metal clattering as his camera hit the ground. Evan picked it up with shaking hands, the red recording light still blinking. He replayed the last seconds of footage. Darren's terrified face stared back, whispering, "They're right behind me," one final time before the screen went black. The group froze, the weight of realization crashing down. Darren hadn't wandered off. He had been taken. And whatever claimed him wasn't finished yet. The moment Darren vanished, the asylum seemed to breathe. The silence that followed was not empty but alive, thick with unseen movement, like the walls themselves were shifting to close in around the survivors. Evan gripped Darren's dropped camera so tightly his knuckles turned white. The tiny red light blinked like a heartbeat, steady and mocking. Jenna stood frozen, her flashlight trembling in her grip, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Marcus cursed under his breath, pacing in a circle as though trying to deny what just happened. "He can't just disappear," he muttered, his voice cracking. "He's messing with us. He has to be." But even he didn't sound convinced. The sound came then, soft at first, a shuffling drag across the concrete floor. Then another. Then many. From every direction. The explorers spun wildly, flashlights cutting jagged beams through the dust. Empty rows of broken chairs stared back at them from the surgical theater's shadows. But the sound grew louder. Footsteps, chains, whispers all layering together, forming a cacophony that pressed into their ears until they wanted to scream. The air grew colder, so cold that frost began to creep along the metal railings. The cameras flickered again, their screens flashing images that didn't belong, patients strapped to chairs, faces twisted in agony, doctors standing over them with tools that gleamed in the dim light. None of it was happening in front of them, yet it filled their cameras, overlapping the reality they thought they knew. "It's not just ghosts," Jenna whispered, her voice hollow. "We're in it, we're inside what they did here." Suddenly, the central chair in the theater snapped upright with a metallic screech, as though invisible hands had pulled it into place. The straps flailed, tightening and curling like snakes searching for flesh. The overhead lamp above it flared to life in a blinding white glow, flooding the room with harsh light. For the first time, they saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. Patients in tattered gowns, faces pale and ruined, eyes empty holes of black. Doctors in bloodstained coats stood among them, their mouths moving silently, rehearsing orders from decades ago. The explorers backed into each other, hearts pounding, every instinct screaming to run, but their legs refused to obey. The air was heavy, pressing them into place, as if the asylum itself had claimed them as part of its performance. Then came the screaming. Not from the ghosts, but from the walls themselves, vibrations rattling the floor, the ceiling, their own bones. It was endless, the kind of sound that seared itself into the brain. The explorers clutched their ears, cameras tumbling to the ground, still recording every impossible moment. Evan's voice cracked as he shouted over the noise, "We have to move. Now." But the others hesitated, rooted in terror. The line between past and present was gone. The asylum had awakened, and it wasn't going to let them go without a fight. The asylum didn't release them, it consumed them one by one. After Darren vanished and the ghosts revealed themselves, panic tore through the group.
They ran blindly through endless corridors, their flashlights jerking across walls smeared with old blood and patient scrawlings that seemed to shift as they passed. Every door they tried was locked, every stairwell collapsed, every hallway looped back on itself. It was as though the asylum had rearranged itself, sealing them in a maze they could never escape. Jenna was the next to go. She tripped as they rounded a corner, her flashlight clattering away, spinning its beam across the ceiling. For a heartbeat, Evan and Marcus saw it, a pale figure crouched upside down, clinging to the rafters like a spider. By the time they reached her, something yanked her screaming into the dark above. Her voice echoed long after it was gone, fading into whispers that followed them down the hall. Marcus lost his nerve completely. He screamed at Evan, accusing him of leading them here, of dooming them. His rage turned to sobs, then silence, as the shadows pulled him into a doorway that hadn't been there a moment before. Evan didn't see what took him, only heard the door slam shut and lock. He didn't try to open it. He couldn't. His mind was unraveling too fast. By dawn, Evan was the last one left, staggering through hallways that no longer looked abandoned. The walls gleamed as if freshly painted, lights flickered overhead, and faint echoes of doctors giving orders drifted through the air. He passed rooms filled with patients, some weeping, some laughing, some staring with hollow eyes. They didn't touch him, but they watched him, tracking his every step as if he were the show now. His camera hung around his neck, still recording, its battery impossibly alive. Finally, he reached a boarded window at the end of a hall. Desperation gave him strength. He smashed through the boards with his bare hands until splinters tore his skin and blood smeared across the wood. He forced himself through the gap, tumbling onto the cold grass outside just as the first rays of dawn painted the sky. For the first time all night, the asylum was silent behind him. He stumbled home hours later, dirt and blood clinging to him like another skin. When he finally dared to replay the footage, his hands shook so badly he almost dropped the camera. What he saw wasn't what he remembered. The video showed him calmly walking the halls, speaking to no one, staring blankly into the lens. In the background, the voices of his friends screamed for help, echoing through corridors he didn't react to, as if he hadn't heard them at all. The asylum had let him go, but not untouched. Evan realized with dawning horror that maybe he hadn't escaped at all. Maybe he had never left.